Now, what can we say because we can characterize Afghan history into different chunks, and
Yes.
after 2001, let's say after the Mullah Omar Loya
Yeah.
Jirga, we've had our fair share of Loya Jirgas after the American invasion. What have those looked
Yes.
like?
Yeah. So first of all, in 2001, after 9/11, the United States single-handedly decided to invade Afghanistan, and shortly after that, in 2002, there was a conference in Bonn, in Germany, where a lot of warlords and all these people who sided with the Americans during the invasion, they were all invited to discuss how they want to form a new government during occupation of Afghanistan. And these leaders consisted of many figures. And during that Bonn conference, they decided to call an emergency Jirga in that exact same year, where they would select a new interim president, because they couldn't organize an election right away, so they needed an interim government. And for that interim government, there was the necessity of a president. And that emergency Jirga was convened in 2002, where Karzai basically
Ahmed Karzai became the transitional president.
Yes. And after that emergency Jirga, as it was already decided by the same group of people that they should have a new constitution, and so they organized a constitutional Loya Jirga. And this Jirga was organized so that they could draft a new constitution for a new Afghanistan.
Sure. I think this was the Jirga in which Zahid Shah also attended and was given the title of Babai Millet. But I think there's also the point here that I want to raise, that a lot of these people who were at the table writing and approving this new constitution have now had the epiphany that this constitution is way too centralized. Yes. So they wrote it, and I wonder what caused that change in thinking. But yeah, so 2000
or maybe they didn't wrote it. Maybe someone else wrote the constitution, because this is obviously, as we discuss Afghanistan's history and politics, we come across so many topics that we have to discuss in future episodes. So this is, I promise you guys, this is a elaborate topic for a future episode, how the constitution of 2003 was drafted. But basically, the purpose of this Jirga was to come up with a new constitution for Afghanistan. And in this Jirga, you had all these different committees of different, under leadership of different figures. Abdurrab Rasul Sayaf had his own committee, and some other guy, all these guys, they had their own committees, and they together, in a very magical and way, they all came up with this one document, which to people who know more about this particular era, they know that most of the document was already written by someone else, and who that someone else is, again,
is everyone's guess.
Yes. So they came up with a constitution, and this constitution was accepted, and all these guys, Yunus Qanuni, who is from Jamiat Islami, and he was representing, Rabbani was also present. All these guys, they were all present, and they all approved this constitution. And when this constitution was approved, they also planned a general election. So there was a general election a few years later, and during those elections, Hamid Karzai was elected as president, and he served his first term. And when he reached the second round of, the second elections, presidential elections in 2009, after winning that election, Hamid Karzai, during his inauguration, announced that he will have a peace Jirga. And this peace jirga had a purpose to talk about how to create lasting peace in Afghanistan, because the war in Afghanistan between the government, the Americans, the foreign troops, and the Taliban was going on for years, and
it was intensifying. It was getting worse.
Exactly. Yes. So he announced that he is going to organize a jirga, and this jirga was eventually, under very difficult circumstances and all sorts of problems, this jirga was convened in 2010. But what's so typical of this jirga, the main party that was a part of the conflict, the Taliban, they were not part of the jirga.
So I remember. Not only did they boycott the jirga. So for just to highlight this to people. So Hamid Karzai in 2010 decides that we need to have a massive grand assembly of tribal and ethnic representatives from all over the country to decide peace with the Taliban. But the Taliban were not at the jirga. And not only were they not at the jirga, they boycotted it, and they said, actually, we're going to attack you if you go ahead with this jirga. And they were true to their word, and they did. So, the jirga, once again, this centuries-old institution, I don't know what to say, mocked. It is a bit of a mockery. And then I think Sangar, he had another one a couple of years later. I think it was in regarding the bilateral security agreement with the Americans. Where Sabghatullah Mujahideen threatened to walk out.
Yes, so after several years of war, there was then another suggestion that we should have a bilateral security agreement with the United States, because even around 2005, 2006, there were a lot of people in America, politicians, they were saying for how long is this war going to last? So the war needed to end. And by the way, a very significant point that basically triggered this bilateral security agreement is the fact that in 2011, Osama bin Laden was killed by the United States. So the leader of Al-Qaeda was dead. So people were asking, why do we have to still stay in Afghanistan? Why do we have to be involved in that country? Well, the solution was we need to be in a bilateral security agreement with Afghanistan so that we can have our permanent bases in that country. And obviously, people in Afghanistan were vehemently opposed to this idea. And Karzai, he felt he's a very shrewd politician, so he was very well aware of the fact that people will not just accept this. So he said,
he was in his last term of office, so
exactly, yeah. So he said, you know what? We're going to have a jirga, because this agreement it's very problematic, and that's why he called for a jirga. And during that time, the discussion around this bilateral security agreement was very polarizing, because there were other major events at that time. For instance, we have these cross-border shelling from Pakistan along the Durand Line.
Yeah, we have a lot of skirmishes still going on.
Exactly. As we talked about this in our previous episode with Amina Khan, it is a very major, important issue, a conflict issue between Afghanistan and Pakistan. There are cases where people have witnessed how Pakistani troops have encroached into Afghanistan territory beyond the Durand Line. And there are also many issues between Afghanistan and Iran along the western border. So Afghanistan is being basically attacked by both of its neighbors, while the foreign troops, the Americans, with all their power and might, are present. And the bilateral agreement it is said in the bilateral agreement that the United States will defend Afghanistan against anyone else who poses a threat to Afghanistan.
I think this is a lesson in U.S. diplomacy. Pakistan, major non-NATO U.S. ally, is attacking Afghanistan, which is also a major non-NATO US ally, but it's more like its protectorate. But even as its protectorate, it's in the word protector, so it's supposed to protect Afghanistan, and it's not doing so whilst discussing a bilateral security agreement to protect Afghanistan.
Yes, so that was something that was happening at that time, and this bilateral security agreement had a very, very controversial point, and that was that it would absolve the American troops from prosecution in Afghanistan. So it was giving the Americans carte blanche so that they could just go ahead and kill and murder anyone they want. Nobody would ever prosecute them. And that's also something most Afghans...
That is what actually happened. Bear in mind.
That's what happened. So Karzai called for this Jirga, and during that Jirga, as you mentioned, Sibghatullah Mujahideen, he said that if you guys don't approve of this agreement, I will leave Afghanistan. And he was emotionally blackmailing the people of Afghanistan because obviously he's a Mujahideen, he's a spiritual leader with a very long track record, and he was in favor of this agreement.
Quite an interesting 180 turn from the Mujahid who fought against the Soviets to now blackmailing the country into leaving it if they didn't sign this agreement. And I think it's worth mentioning that eventually the bilateral security agreement was signed, but it wasn't signed by Karzai. The Karzai who came to Afghanistan in the back of US aircraft by his second term had become quite anti-American. He didn't sign this, and amidst a lot of backroom deals, shady details that were very opaque and which are still opaque, we don't actually know what the details of 2014 were. That Ashraf Ghani became the president and Abdullah became the chief executive officer. And the first thing Ashraf Ghani did was what? He signed the bilateral security agreement.
Yes. And basically, this agreement, basically we have to refer back to this point later on because it's very relevant for our current context. This agreement is in many ways similar to the agreement of Gandomak.
Well,
because Afghanistan...
We'll explain. Gandomak has its own sort of place in the Afghan imagination. I think Ashraf Ghani's been talking about it a lot since the since the negotiations with the Taliban and the deal.